One of the most interesting parts of the Nintendo Switch 2 is the addition of GameCube to the Nintendo Switch Online service. The GameCube was Nintendo's 6th generation console that used optical media and continued the push into 3D after the earlier Nintendo 64 set the groundwork. The GameCube hardware was powerful, and its 3D capabilities were quite advanced, and the result was some stunning looking games that were built for the hardware, many of which still hold up to this day. Right now, as it stands, GameCube on the Switch 2 is decent, but there are some underlying issues that, in my opinion, Nintendo desperately needs to fix. Just like the Nintendo 64, which had a shaky start, Nintendo did iterate and resolve many of the issues on the N64 service, but not all of them. And it appears as though the GameCube service is following a similar trajectory. But let's begin. First impressions of the service seem very good. The games appear to run quite well, and there's definitely some resolution upscaling going on here. Without knowing exactly, it appears that all games are increased internally by 2x up to 960p. Unfortunately, however, with this type of upscaling, it does affect 2D HUD elements. Take for example the Legend of Zelda Wind Waker. These HUD elements still appear to be quite low res, and this mismatch between 3D and 2D does become quite apparent. Now, to be clear, this is not the fault of the GameCube NSO service. Many emulators that handle 3D internal resolution upscaling will have the exact same issue, but one thing that I would like to see on the service would be some type of downsampling filter. That is, when you render a game at a higher resolution, in this instance 2 times, and then scale it back down to fit the display itself. This process is also known as supersampling, and it can improve image quality by reducing aliasing and creating a sharper, smoother image that's uniform across 3D and 2D elements in the game. This would go a long way to reduce the imperfections that we see with the 2D HUD elements in the games. Now, downsampling would be a nice thing to have, but we're talking about a feature rather than some underlying issue, and that's when we have to turn our attention to input lag. Just like the Nintendo 64 service, input lag with the GameCube service is a huge problem. Now, of course, when we talk about emulation, input lag is always going to be a thing. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, input lag is effectively the time between a button press and the action of that button press registering on screen. Now, when games are built, there's always going to be some type of delay, but the longer the delay, the worse the gameplay experience will be. And when it comes to emulation, there's always going to be an additional amount of lag that's applied. The easiest way I can demonstrate input lag is the save selection screen in The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker. Now, this is captured at 60 FPS with my Nintendo Switch 2 in handheld mode and using a Pro controller. Now, I'm simply recording my camera pointing to the Switch 2, filming at 60 FPS, so please allow for a margin of error. But note the delay between when I release the analog stick to when the save slot switches to the next one. Now, I don't have any scientific way of measuring it, but if we count each individual frame in Premiere Pro, we're talking about 8 frames of lag. Coincidentally, when we tested the NSO service with N64 a few years back, that also contained a similar amount of input lag. Now, in some instances, 8 frames of lag won't really make a difference, and you may not even feel it, but with a fast-paced game like F-Zero or Soul Calibur 2, it can really take you out of the experience very quickly. And many users have reported input lag with GameCube titles on NSO as well. This issue is not tied directly to The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker either. F-Zero GX and Soul Calibur 2 also have quite poor input lag. A very easy way to test this is to go into practice mode in Soul Calibur 2. Notice the time between the button press and the sword swing. And as a comparison, I ran the Dolphin emulator on my Steam Deck, and immediately you can notice the difference in input lag across both emulators. And to make it a fair comparison, we're using the analog sticks and buttons on the console themselves. Once again, 8 frames of lag on the GameCube NSO service, while Dolphin on the Steam Deck fares much better, sitting at around 4 to 5 frames of input lag. Now it goes without saying that this input lag is quite high, and it's something that I would like to see Nintendo resolve with up-and-coming updates of the GC NSO service. Right now, if you're a casual player, you won't even know what I'm talking about, but to many of us who grew up playing the GameCube, these games will feel much heavier for no real reason, and it's thanks to the input lag. Now of course, by itself, input lag is not the end of the world. Unfortunately, however, there exists another issue with the emulation that affects the analog controls, regardless if you're playing in handheld mode, using a Pro controller, or even using a GameCube controller, and that is, the analog stick is not properly calibrated, and there is an underlying issue with the sensitivity of the analog stick, as it appears that the full range is not mapped one-to-one to that of an original GameCube controller. If you played F-Zero GX on the GameCube, or even Dolphin, analog movement seems nowhere near as sensitive as it does on the NSO version. This issue was first discovered by user Piccolo, and credit goes to them. I will leave a link to their YouTube video in the description below, which outlines the issue in more detail and uses an input overlay to better show what's going on. The video shows that the analog movement scales much faster than normal, and when you play F-Zero GX, it's much too easy to oversteer and to slam into barriers. In comparison, this is the Dolphin version on my Steam Deck, which is properly calibrated and feels more in line with the original game. Now it's possible to use the F-Zero calibration tool to dial in the calibration that's close to the GameCube original. This can be done by expanding the dead zone by using the D-pad. What this does is offset where the input value of 0 begins and adjust the range to map it closer to the true edge of the stick. However, this workaround is only specific to F-Zero GX, and we have to be clear that this issue is an overarching emulation issue with GameCube NSO. The hope, of course, is that Nintendo can address this issue in an updated GC NSO revision. F-Zero GX on the GameCube was an incredible experience. It ran at an almost locked 60 FPS with only a very rare amount of slowdown in some parts of the game, and this is a 2002 release. The game applied some very interesting visual effects such as heat haze, per pixel lighting and detailed textures. It even has a toggle for 16:9 widescreen mode that opens up the viewport nicely. The last issue with GameCube on NSO is not a specific issue to GameCube games, rather it's the overarching network on the NSO service. And let's not sugarcoat it, the networking implementation on NSO sucks, just like it always has. And this is the issue that I have. The online functionality for NSO on Switch 2 has not been updated. Nintendo has done nothing to improve this at all. But let's be clear, this may be a difficult problem to solve, but it can be solved for. What makes this interesting is that as more advanced hardware is added to NSO, the online experience will only get worse, and let me explain why. In order to host online matches using GameCube games, up to 4 players must establish connections with each other, and this is known as peer-to-peer or P2P. Now, in order to maintain the state of up to 4 players, these states must be synchronized, which means that each player's state of the contents of their RAM needs to be sent over the wire to each other many times per second. And we have to remember that the GameCube has 48 megabytes of RAM. Usually this is done by sending the differences in data between packets and not the entire 48 megabytes of RAM that the GameCube has. But regardless, each time a packet is dropped or missed, each user's session must pause for a moment while the state corrects itself. This is why we see stutters, pauses, and poor networking. And in my experience, it doesn't seem to matter if you have a wide LAN connection or Wi-Fi, the problem always persists. There are times when the network can fix itself and you can get into some really good online matches. For me, it seems like the late evening is the best time to get into NSO online matches, but most of the time you're going to be playing online NSO matches that run like this. It's not great, and I do wish Nintendo put more time and resources into providing a better online NSO experience. After all, we are paying for the service. In conclusion, none of these issues for me are deal breakers by themselves, but when you combine them all together, it's apparent that the NSO service could be so much better. Now, I am still very happy to see GameCube games on Switch 2. But just like we saw with the N64 service, it is difficult to put confidence in Nintendo that they will address these issues. If I did have to rank them in order, the analog sensitivity issue must be addressed first, along with improvements to input delay, then the online networking and performance. What we have today is good, but it could be so much better. And when I look back at the N64 service, they did address various issues to improve the service over time. but the input delay is still a thing with most games, and there are still issues with control stick sensitivity and various other issues. And with that, we'll have to see how much attention they'll put into making the GameCube games a better service overall. Hopefully, we'll start to see some updates coming soon. But let me know what you thought about this video in the comments below, and tell me about your experiences playing GameCube games on NSO. If you're a casual player, you may not even realize some of these issues that we've talked about today. But if you're a hardcore F-Zero gamer, you may be feeling a little more frustrated with how the game plays. But that's going to do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, please don't forget to leave me a like, leave a comment below, and we will catch you guys in the next episode. Bye for now.